What is the entire history of the science versus religion / Jesus debate?
Okay. All right. So I know why you say, good Lord, you saw my notes.
Yeah.
But all right, we're not going to give an entire history of it. There's no way we can do that.
Okay.
But I will give some summary points.
You can upload as long as you want of a video on YouTube.
This is true.
I think.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
All right. So the interesting thing about all of this is that it did not begin as a debate.
Okay.
It's not like you had science and then religion came on the scene and there was a debate, or there was religion and then science came on the scene and there was a debate immediately. That's not the way it played out. So the study of the world around us was not in opposition to theology.
Okay.
All right. So the study of God and the study of the world, so theology, the study of God, okay, and then what was more labeled kind of like your natural philosophy, or before it was labeled as science, that idea of studying the natural world, like studying those two things weren't viewed as an opposition to one another. All right. And so
who ruined it?
All right, give me a second. We'll get to who ruined it. But
because I got a feeling the Christians ruined it.
No, they actually didn't on this one.
Okay.
All right. So there's science and philosophy and theology that were all interconnected fields of study.
Okay.
They weren't seen as like these branches that could not coexist with one another, often in the way it's framed now.
That's because the scientists didn't know anything yet. That completely disproved the religious people.
Okay. That's your theory.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I asked you the entire history, so I guess we'll keep going.
Yeah, we'll keep going. All right. So people saw
a little bit of foreshadowing there.
So people sought to understand the world in which they lived. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. So they began engaging in the studying of the natural world, which is what eventually became known as science.
Okay.
All right. So the scientists were not trying to prove that there was not a God, or they were not going into it believing there was not a God, but rather they were studying the world around them because so many of them actually believed there was a God, and they wanted to see how this God actually created the world in which they lived.
They were studying observable things.
Correct.
Or as much as they could.
For as much as they could.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously you have the development of, the scientific method, which begins to move into a place of not only the observable, but gave space for hypothetical as well.
Okay.
Right? But even within that, it's again, what can I observe? What can I see as fact? Right? And then go from there.
Okay.
All right. Where it really kind of began to, I guess, split, if you want to put it that way, and where a quote unquote debate between science and religion began to occur was really in the 19th century with Charles Darwin.
Okay.
All right. And most of us are familiar with his work on evolution.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so, and what his theory of evolution did was directly attack a basic premise of the worldview that Christians had of God creating humanity.
Okay.
All right. And so
every single other person on the planet believed that God created humanity. And then one guy who looked at a bird and was like, God doesn't exist. Completely blew that up forever.
No, I'm not saying that every other person in the world believed there was a God.
Okay.
I'm saying he kind of was he was kind of the pioneer in the field of science, saying that science doesn't jive with religion.
Okay.
Okay. Or in particular with a Christian worldview.
Was he trying to do that? Or was he...
I don't think he was setting out to try to necessarily go on this attack of God.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was simply trying to follow what he believed was the evidence in front of him scientifically.
Okay.
Now, again, what it led him to was a theory.
Right.
Unfortunately, that theory began then being taught decades later as fact.
Okay.
Okay. And so, but in his book, Origin of the Species, or On the Origin of the Species, he deduced that humans evolved over time and were not created, quote unquote, human as we once thought. So rather, they began as simple organisms and they naturally evolved over time to being the complex beings that we are today.
Okay.
All right. So this, along with...
So how does that compete against religion? Why is that such a threat?
He was doing it in the Origin of the Species, and specifically in regards to humans and the evolution of humanity. Okay. So there's that one, premise that automatically was against an understanding of Christianity's view that God made Adam and Eve, or God made humanity as complex beings from point one.
Okay.
Where he's saying they actually evolved from something that was much more simple.
Okay.
Okay. And then, of course, that opens...
What theologically does that threaten?
A doctrine of creation.
Just that?
Just that.
Not about who we are as people or anything?
Well, sure. Because thank you for bringing that up, because it's not just the doctrine of creation, but within the doctrine of creation is embedded a doctrine of the image of God, that we are bearers of the image of God. Okay. And for Darwin, he was actually, so his whole idea of evolution would have gone against an understanding of humans being formed in the image of God. Okay. As rational.
If I keep asking questions, we're going to get too deep on
yes,
that.
yes. Because we're rational,
yeah,
free will beings.
So I guess the last question would be could we not have evolved into the image of God?
Okay. How about we do a whole, or we do a later episode on that.
Fine.
So that we don't get trapped there forever.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Well, you are saying that this is the first time that
sure,
the split happened for this topic. So
correct.
So yeah. Anyway, whatever.
All right. All right.
Okay.
And what it opens up then is not just the origin of humanity, but the origin of creation itself, or the universe itself.
So it's threatening Christianity from page 1.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So in Genesis 1:1,
right. If the beginning's wrong, why am I going to read the rest?
Right. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
From a scientific perspective.
Right. So if I'm reading Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
And now I'm being told that's not true.
Right.
Right. It breaks, the whole.
Right. What's the point of the rest?
Right. Everything breaks down.
Yeah. I'm not even going to get to Jesus. He's like 2,000 pages later.
Right. So.
Depending on how
thick the Bible
big your font is.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So you've got Darwin's push, okay? And then you've got other factors such as the Industrial Revolution, which moved the Western world into modernism and into a modern worldview which deemed science and not religion as the source of the great questions of life. In other words, it was the source of answering the questions of life, such as origin and purpose, morality and destiny.
Okay.
And it was really at this point that science and religion started to become at odds.
Okay.
Because within modernism, science became the quote-unquote religion. Okay? It became the answer point. And so therefore...
Because we were figuring out how to do miracles with...
Yeah, and discovering things the world had never known before.
Yeah.
And so, the jumping point was, well, we didn't know that. We know it now. It must not be congruent with Christianity or be okay with Christianity. Therefore, we're going to reject an idea of God.
Okay.
And so, modern atheism was birthed out of this.
Out of
this
science.
Out of this modernistic worldview.
Okay.
Okay.
What was old atheism?
Well, there was
Or
just,
wasn't there?
I mean, there was just the belief that there was not God, but this atheism was rooted in science specifically.
Okay.
So this is like what you would be called, like, known as like the classical atheist,
Okay.
that rooted their belief that there was no God in science, saying science disproved it.
Right.
Okay. Or science, even if it didn't disprove that there was a God, it would not allow for there to be a God.
Oh, okay.
Because it would be deemed too unreasonable.
So there's no room for God to be in this world because of everything that we know now.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And so that was kind of the movement of it. But in the midst of all this happening in the 20th century, so this is all kind of happening in the 20th century, right?
God was doing his own science.
Late 1800s and the 20th century. But what's interesting is, like, 60% of all Nobel Prize winners in the world in the area of science in the 20th century were Christians.
Okay.
So there wasn't this sense, like, it wasn't like just across the world that every scientist just stopped being a Christian or simply was not a Christian. And so many scientists are actually Christian now. I remember speaking, I was speaking one time on worldviews and sharing about, like, the cosmological argument and fine-tuning argument and those kind of things. And I didn't know it at the time, but one of the directors of the CDC, however you feel about the CDC, but one of the directors of the CDC was actually in attendance.
I love the CDC.
Good job. Yeah, we're not canceled. Yeah. All right. So, but one of the directors of the CDC.
Everything they say is right.
All right. So. What's in the cup, Nate?
What?
Nothing. All right. So. So one of the directors of the CDC happened to be in attendance when I was sharing on this.
Mm-hmm. And they stood up and said, wrong.
Nope. He actually came up to me afterwards and he said, actually, most scientists that I know that work with us, and he himself was a scientist, he said, actually are Christians.
Okay.
So that was his perspective. Okay. And he wasn't saying that all scientists were Christians. He was saying the ones that were working with him that he knew were Christians. Mm-hmm. Okay. That even as there's this continued propping up of science as anti-religion, I think that's specifically found in the academy, in universities.
Okay.
And I'm not saying it's not found in other places as well, but you see a lot of that in a lot of scientists work in universities. So it's kind of like a blanket statement. But what I'm saying is, I think you find a lot of that teaching being passed down in the universities where, well, of course, if you're in a science class, surely you cannot believe that there is a personal God that created everything. And, you know, and I mean, and going to one of the public universities I went to, that was the case. Like, surely you don't believe that.
Didn't you go to Jesus classes?
I did for my Master's of Divinity, and actually in one of those classes, I had a professor, and he was a sociologist, but a professor like questioned my sanity for how could I actually believe that there was a God? Yet he was one of my professors.
Cool. You thought we were teaching on the Bible this semester.
Right.
Wrong.
False.
Yeah.
So
here's a science.
Yeah.
Read it.
Yeah. So I really believe the idea of science having to be against religion is just not reality. Even though that, I believe, has probably become the common perception of it.
All right. Well, all the science people say you're wrong. Every single one of them.
Because they're all against Christianity, obviously.